Thanks, Nigel, and good afternoon, everyone. As you can see, if you were part of the initial conversation right at the start of this, unlike David and Nigel, I haven't attempted to cut my own hair or my beard for some time, so I'm sort of desperately waiting for those restrictions to be lifted. I'm really pleased that Nigel asked me to speak today. I know that you previously had an update from Jeff, who will be known to many of you, obviously having been in Suffolk for many years. What I'm going to do in the next half an hour is obviously kind of try to unpick some of what came out today about the process of awarding grades this summer. We'll probably spend most of the time on that over the next half an hour or so. We'll then look a bit at the remote learning expectations going forward, particularly in light of school reopenings from the 8th of March. Then we'll think a little bit about Ofsted, and finally think a bit about performance data. I've met some of you on this call, I know, but many of you I haven't. If I've not met you, I started at ASCL as a curriculum and inspection specialist in September last year. In January, so last month, my role expanded to include all secondary and post-16 qualifications, assessment, performance and accountability. So just a few things going on in my area at the moment. So if you do have any questions going forward about any aspect, then please always do be in touch. Before working at ASCL, I worked for SSAT, the School Students and Teachers Network, formerly the Specialist Schools and Academies Trust for many years. And before that, I was a middle leader and a senior leader over the border in Essex. I'm also a governor of a primary school, a secondary school and a PRU, and the founding director of a multi-academy trust here in East London, where I'm based. So these are issues that I think about on a daily basis. I am going to share my screen in a moment. I won't be able to see the chat when I do that, but if you do have questions, then please do put them in the chat. Either we can revisit those right at the end, or equally, if there's anything burning, I'll ask Nigel or Dave or Rob to jump in and ask those on your behalf if it feels particularly pressing. Also, I should say I'll send all of these slides to Alison immediately after the presentation, so you'll have these slides immediately to use as you want with your own head. So I'm going to start with today's announcements around the grading of GCSEs, A-levels and VTQs. I think it's very fair to say that there was never going to be a perfect solution, and certainly at ASCL, what we found from the conversations that we had with you as members, from the various different emails into our coronavirus inbox, is there were those head teachers that felt very strongly that exams should go ahead as normal. There were those that felt that there should be some sort of mandatory exams, and there were those that felt there should be no exams whatsoever. So I think that the key point here is it was always going to be very, very difficult to please everyone. I think where we've ended up is a good compromise. So what I'm going to do sort of first of all is talk through the key points about this, and then maybe where some of the issues might be and where potentially some of the mitigations of those issues might come from. So top level overview, as we know, no huge surprises here. The grading of all of those qualifications will be based on teacher assessment. Now, of course, the department and Ofqual are very wary of using the term CAGs again. We've been very clear, it's not individual teacher assessment, it is a whole school or whole college process, but the term that's being used is teacher assessment. So that's one that we'll have to grin and bear. Students will only be assessed on the content that they have been taught. So unlike in previous years, in a normal year, where typically, depending on the qualification, around 50% of course content is covered by the exams, those teachers will only need to make that assessment based on whatever content you have been able to teach students that are entering exams this year. And of course, that is one way that we can mitigate the impact of differential learning loss, both at a centre or school level, but also for individual students. In terms of what that assessment will look like, there will be a very flexible use of assessment materials. Schools will be able to use a range of different evidence, including their own exam papers, their own questions, homework tasks and mock exams that you may have done, and of course, exam board produced papers. There will be internal and external quality assurance, which I'll come on to. As I'm sure you will have picked up, the results days have both moved forward in terms of when they usually are, and also are both in the same week. Both A-level and GCSE results days will be the week beginning the 9th of August. We'll talk a bit about the appeals process, and then perhaps what we weren't expecting and wasn't actually in the consultation is there will, as there was last year, be a full autumn series available for any students who, even after that appeals process, feel they haven't got the grade they deserve. So thinking about this use of teacher assessment and evidence, there will be that the range of evidence used, and teachers will have the flexibility to use their professional judgments on the inferences they make about that evidence. So there'll be no particular weighting for example, exam board produced material or mock exams and so on. The exam board materials are entirely optional. There will be at least some new material for every qualification. However, a majority of that exam board produced material will be past papers. But again, that will be presented in a number of different ways. So teachers could choose to use the past paper in its entirety. They could obviously remove questions about content that hadn't been studied. But all of those assessment materials drawn from the past paper will also be presented in different ways by the exam boards. For example, topic theme questions, questions pitched at certain levels. So it won't just be a set of past papers. So the evidence that your teachers can use to make that judgment can be drawn from any time during the course of study. And again, here this comes down to the inferences and the professional judgment that teachers make about those assessments. So we know that one of the concerns that your students and your parents are likely to have is that obviously if, for example, mock exams are being used that were done in December, when students didn't know that was going to count towards their final grade and may well have tried harder had they known that, then of course teachers can build that in to their professional judgment. So if they know that was the case, again, the way in which they reach that judgment is all about teachers' professional expertise. As I said, only assessed on content that has been taught. There is no minimum percentage of the content in a particular qualification that has to have been studied, but I'll come on to that in a moment. But there is no minimum percentage of content. And of course, what this means is there's potentially quite significant differences between the grading in different subjects. And I think this is where the challenges around leadership and governance and that quality assurance comes in. So for a subject like my own, like English or history, if you haven't done one of the texts and you've done 2 out of the four texts you're expected to study, then you can still say, actually, I can demonstrate this student is a grade 9 student or an A-star student at A-level. I think it's much more difficult when we get into subjects like maths and sciences, where that grade 9 material may indeed be content that hasn't yet been studied because of the ongoing effects of the pandemic. So I think the devil here will be in the detail in what's provided by the exam boards, but I think it's important from a leadership and governance point of view not to assume that the way that looks in every subject will be the same, and we need to respect the disciplinary nature of those different subjects. And I think the exam boards will be very nuanced about that. And as I'm sure that you're already aware, and I'm sure it's already marked in red on your calendars, the final submission date for those grades is Friday, the 18th of June. So one of the big questions, and one of the things that the media have kind of picked up on this morning is, doesn't this lead to a free-for-all? And what's to stop rampant grade inflation? Well, I think that is an ongoing concern. but equally there is a sense of national standard. Of course, since the revisions to qualifications under the coalition government, we've moved away from criterion referencing in any way whatsoever at all, and usually the standard is set statistically through comparable outcomes. So what we can expect is that the exam boards will produce enough support material that gives some definition of a national standard, so that a B in one school will look like a B in another school, regardless of where you are in the country. Of course, that's going to be less robust than it usually would for an exam, and I think we have to accept that. But again, there was no perfect solution, I don't think, this year. That will include grade descriptors for probably every second grade, maybe wider brackets than that, but it will also include other forms of support, for example, exemplar materials for every grade, mark schemes, and so on. And one of the things that we've been pushing very hard in our conversations with Ofqual and the exam boards is that we really need to make sure that teachers have the support and the reassurance and the protection from the exam board to say, no, this is genuinely a B, and this is the exam board evidence of why that's the case. And I think that's going to be very important. But again, the devil will be in the detail. And then obviously, one thing, there was a decision not to make the exam board produced assessments mandatory. They will be optional, but I think one thing that a lot of schools and colleges may want to do is to use externally set assessments, whether that's from the exam boards, whether that's from commercial partners, to provide that reassurance for their teachers, and it just gives teachers that little bit of extra support and protection. So I think that will certainly we'll certainly see an increase of that. In terms of what this means for the discussions that your teachers might be having with students over the coming months, so there is an expectation that you will discuss that basket or portfolio of evidence that teachers are using to reach the final grade. So teachers will say, well, I'm using these pieces of evidence. And of course, the whole point of this is to try and reduce the number of appeals that we might have over the summer, where hopefully there's no surprises in there. And of course, that evidence may well include either graded or marked piece of work, so students might have a fairly good sense of where they're working at. However, as with last year, as with the CAGs last year, students must not be told their final submitted grade. So it's a little bit woolly here, I think, and again, we're pushing for more details on this, but it's okay for teachers to talk about the evidence that they're using, including any graded piece of evidence. However, that final submitted grade must not be discussed. And the reason I bring this up so early is we have already had questions from members about whether or not teachers can talk to students about their work at the moment and can grade pieces of work. And absolutely, yes, they can. So in terms of the internal quality assurance, obviously there'll be guidance from the exam boards about what robust internal QA looks like. One of the kind of contentious topics was the extent to which historical data should be used. And I think the point here is that there is an expectation that you should look at your previous historical data and say, from the header center level, does this look realistic? Can I sign off on this based on our historical data? However, unlike the algorithm last year, it's absolutely not a limiting factor. And that every centre's internal QA policy will be signed off by the individual exam boards. So I won't go into tons of detail about this slide because I could probably do a whole half hour just on this slide. But as heads of centre, this is the list of requirements that you will be asked to sign. And I think it's worth sort of thinking through these and the implications of them. So just to point out a couple of them, you can see there that the historical data is there in the in that fourth bullet point down. and equally that students should be entered. So the only students that you should be entering are students who are planning the qualifications this summer. And again, of course, the difference this year is that the submission deadline for entries on the 21st of February was after the decision to cancel exams. So if there are centres who are considering entering large numbers of year 10 or year 12 for early entry, you have to sign the legal declaration to say you're not doing that, but also when we come onto the external QA, that will be looked at. I think on that 5th bullet point down, again, that's a useful thing to think about. The point there is no definition of what sufficient content looks like. That's down to an individual centre level. And again, that's because different areas of the country have suffered so differently from the pandemic. And the final point I'll make on this slide, but again, happy to talk about these in more detail afterwards, is that the evidence and records that you use to reach the judgments should be available for inspection. So I think one of the first tasks we need to think about, and certainly I've already kind of been on to the schools that I'm governor of to ask about this, is what are the processes, what are the platforms that we need to use to collate this evidence, so that the heads that I'm governor of can sign that final bullet point there, so we know we have that ready. So in terms of the external QA, the first thing is the exam boards will check that they are happy with your internal quality assurance processes, and then there'll be two styles of checks. There'll be sample checks of materials when exam boards will request to see the evidence of a random sample of schools of every type in every region of the country, but then also risk-based checks. And the key risks that they've flagged are centres that have submitted significant changes in the pattern of their results. So again, year on year, we would expect to see school results pretty stable. And so if a centre is submitting wildly different results from usual, that's not to say they can't do that. It's not to say that they might have the evidence of that, but they can expect far greater external quality assurance. Likewise, any massive change in entry patterns, particularly I think there, any changes to early entry, and of course new centres as well. So two different types of checks that again, I think have been missed out in some of the narrative going around in the headlines this morning, that actually there is a limited but robust external quality assurance process in place. So the outcome of that, so schools and colleges, if the exam boards do decide that you've been too generous, or you've not been generous enough, in the first instance, you'll be asked to investigate and to resubmit your grades. By exception, if you felt you weren't going to do that, then exam boards can change the grades for the whole cohort if there is an unsatisfactory outcome of the investigation or potential exam malpractice. So that's the potential outcome of that external QA. I thought someone's about to come in there, but I'll carry on and then pause just at the end of this section. So in terms of the results days, as we said, the kind of A-level level 3 results day will be on Tuesday the 10th of August. That will also be the day that UCAS confirm university entries and the clearing process will start. So there was some suggestion that the results day might be decoupled from university confirmations. That's no longer the case. That will all happen on Tuesday the 10th. And then 2 days later, on Thursday the 12th of August, will be level 2 GCSE results days. I have to say, for us, this is one of the line in our SAMs. We said this is putting a huge amount of pressure on school leaders, on exam officers, on teachers. It's also changing the dates from the original published dates. And we push that very, very strongly, but here is where we are today. In terms of the appeals process, which perhaps has been the most difficult one to reach agreement on, in the first instance, a candidate will ask their school or college if a procedural or administrative error has occurred. If it has, then you will go back to the board and correct the problem and say, here's the evidence of that admin error. Assuming that it hasn't and the student disagrees with their teacher assessed grade, it will automatically go to the exam board, although you will have to submit that appeal. Neither the school nor the student will pay for that. The school will then submit the evidence to the exam board, and the exam board will decide if the grade represents this phrase, reasonable exercise of professional judgment. So it's not necessarily regrading that evidence, it's saying, based on this evidence, could a professional reach this judgment? That will look at the full range of evidence, not just the exam board material. And I think there was some speculation when the consultation came out that it would only be exam board material. That will be on that full range of evidence. Exam boards can then change the grade. So ultimately, it's the exam boards that do this. And I think what we need to remind students and parents is that grades could go up and down. And the feeling is that potentially there's more likelihood that grades would be marked down by the exam boards than up. So actually going through that appeals process may not be particularly helpful. Finally, word on private candidates. There's a sort of general expectation that those private candidates who are known to you, typically students who are refitting and are past students, there is an expectation that schools and colleges will support those with the assessment. Other private candidates will have options. So DfE are going to publish a list of colleges, schools, trusts who are willing to take on the assessment of private candidates to ensure they can get a grade. But crucially, no school or college will be required to take on any private candidates if they don't think they can provide reliable assessment for those candidates. Just a few slides on VTQs. We can break VTQs broadly into these three sort of categories of VTQs. The first are the ones that are most similar to GCSEs and A-levels. So this applies to all applied generals, including BTECs, Cambridge Nationals, Cambridge Technicals, and the T-levels. In these cases, any written exams are cancelled this year, and teacher assessed grades will be used in their place. Of course, any non-exam assessment, any NEA, should continue to be done if possible. But again, no requirement that all NEA is done. Then you have those qualifications, which probably only applies to any colleges on the call, which are required for entry into occupation or licence to practice qualifications. Those exams will go ahead. If they can't because of public health reasons, then they will be delayed and there's no other option. And then there's a sort of third category that only applies to a small number of qualifications, such as functional skills, ESOL. And in that case, assessments will continue, but if they can't, unlike the licence to practice qualifications, then other evidence could be used. So a sort of halfway house between the two. But certainly for most VTQs, certainly those ones that are like generals, that the same process applies. Just sort of finally on VTQs, any learners that receive calculated grades or centre assessed grades in 2020 for their written exams can bring those forward into the 2021 certification. Those certificating students who were due to finish their course this summer, and non-certificating students who are halfway through their course and maybe going on into 2022, they can get grades through this process. And if you did have candidates who sat exams in January because you ran them when that decision was made directly by schools and colleges, if they're not happy with what they got, they can also receive a teacher assessed grade. So that's been a kind of whirlwind through today's announcement. I can stay on and talk in a lot more detail about this. This slide really is one I've just put in there, which I hope would be helpful for you to take back into school and discuss with either your senior teams or with governors. Just thinking through some of the key considerations around this immediately. So, given that we know there's going to be this real emphasis on teacher assessment, that's going to be different depending on the subject involved. how are you going to make time for that training, that staff development within departments? Because it's very much a departmental training that needs to happen. I think there's very little that can be done high level in terms of that grading. How, as senior leaders, will you protect your teachers from undue pressure from staff and students? What messages are you sending out to staff and students at the moment? It's worth reminding perhaps some particularly sharp elbow parents that if there is evidence of undue pressure on teachers, that can count as exam malpractice on behalf of that parent. And the exam boards have pursued several cases of that relating to the 2020 grading. How are you going to collate that evidence so it's available if needed? What platforms are you going to use? How, as a senior team, will you quality assure the processes and those judgments within departments, bearing in mind that it's going to be, as I said, very much about the disciplinary nature of assessment in that subject? And, you know, I'm sure many of you have already put out messages to your Year 11s and your Year 13s. But what are those key messages this week to senior leaders, to governors, to trustees, to teachers, students, and parents? And I think the one that Jeff has said very strongly is, you know, we're still waiting for some of the detail about what it looks like. What we do know is, unlike last year, students' outcomes are genuinely in their hands. So while we await the details, the best thing that students can do is to continue to learn the curriculum, to revise, and to act on their teachers' feedback, because ultimately the agency of their outcomes is directly with students. And that's the point that Jeff has made today. At that point, Nigel, I'll sort of pause there and just see, is there any sort of immediate questions, or I can continue into the next sections, but I realise that's a lot of information in a very, very pressing topic.
No, that was really helpful. It was really succinct, really helpful. I've got a couple of questions I'd like to, that I've picked up from people. First of all, when the heck will these tests be available? Presumably it will be before Easter.
Yeah, but by the Easter holidays, yeah.
Right. Presumably, I know they're not compulsory, but it probably is really wise for schools to dip into those to do some, because it's a protection mechanism.
Exactly. I mean, look, you know, as a union, we're not going to say that you need to, but having some sort of standardised assessment, as I said, whether that's from the exam boards, whether it's from commercial partners, it does provide that protection in the case of appeals, and let's be honest about that.
Yeah, I've got loads more, but I don't want to hog this. So if anyone else has got questions, just go on reactions and put your hand up, and I'll see it on the participant screen. I hope we'll get it flashed up. But the other thing I know a few heads have said to me is, it presumably is wise for us to collaborate as heads and cross-moderate and support each other by saying, oh, look, you look at my English, I'll look at your English type stuff. Is that a helpful thing to encourage?
Absolutely. I think particularly subject networks, if you've got any cross-county subject networks working effectively, that's a brilliant use of their time.
Yeah.
And yet again, it makes your internal QA process that much more robust, which just protects you going forward.
Yeah, and I'd encourage your heads to use our website for that connectivity, because you can flash it up there and say, well, look, we need to do some networking here on English or history or whatever. Put it out there and let's share that and get that connectivity going, because it's coming rapidly, really. I think there was some real kickback, unfortunately, in a few schools, as there always is, with parents going for the schools and the teachers unnecessarily and unhelpfully. And I guess it'll happen again this summer. So I'm encouraged to see that it is through the exam board. But any guidance on that, Tom? Because
no, I mean, it's going to happen. I think the media headlines this morning were unhelpful about that. I think ultimately, the exam boards are the legal bodies who are giving these certificates out, and through that external QA process, through the appeals process, they are the ones that can ultimately say, we are not happy to give this grade, and they can change it. And I think it's worth reminding parents of that beyond the headlines, yes, the grade is based on teacher assessment, but it is subject to rigorous internal quality assurance. It is subject to nationally defined standards by the exam boards, albeit yet to be defined, but hopefully very, very soon. And ultimately, it's subject to external QA and can be moved up and down. And that, if there is any evidence that parents are putting undue pressure on teachers to award a certain grade, then that is exam malpractice and could be reported to the exam boards, and that individual parent or student could be investigated by the exam board. But of course it's going to happen, and unfortunately it is inevitable. Just drawing on some practice we know some schools did last year in terms of that, being very clear that the parents shouldn't be in touch with individual teachers, having a central inbox that parents can email any inquiries to, all of these sorts of things that I think are quite helpful. But we know it's already started, and I'm sure some of you had that.
That's really good advice. Again,
in the interest of time, Nigel, should I move on and then I can return to any questions at the end? I'm happy. I can stay for half an hour at the end.
Great, it's good. I've got a couple of quite quick ones. Someone's asked about the timing of the appeals. Presumably that's going to be fairly rapid, and that's probably all we know in August.
It would be fairly rapid. It's the idea of moving results days earlier, as I understand it, is that the exam boards acknowledged an appeals process might take longer this year because their moderators, or whatever term you want to use for them, have to look at a slightly wider range of evidence. So that process could take longer, but they're keen to have it completed by the end of summer, so it potentially doesn't impact on young people's ability to go to university. I think one of the reasons I say it's worth thinking about how you collate the evidence now is I think we can probably reduce a significant amount of workload over the summer if you can send that evidence off to the exam board at the click of a button. If I'm really honest, I don't think exam boards will set up any kind of like portal where you have to put your evidence, which is why if you start to think about that now and start, as teachers do your assessment, to have one place they put that evidence, it might just make your lives easier come the August, when I'm sure you'll be desperate to be able to go to get away. So it's why I flagged that so early, which might seem a bit bizarre, but I think it's worth doing.
That's really helpful. The external QA, Tom, that I guess happens in July, fairly early.
Yes. Yeah.
Great.
Yeah. So late June, early July.
Someone's asked about the difference between CAG and TAG. I think we'd have all preferred CAG, but TAG is what we've got.
We really prefer CAG. We pressed for it so many times. We said, look, it's not about individual teachers. It ignores the whole internal QA process. Politically, they just wanted to avoid the phrase CAG. We are where we are with it. It's teacher assessment. And again, I think in terms of that final question there, some of the key messaging to students and parents being, yes, it's been called teacher assessment. Actually, there's far more to it than an individual teacher assessment. But we are where we are. So remote learning going forwards. Obviously, even after schools return in 2 weeks' time on the 8th of March, that remote learning continuity direction is in place until the end of the school year. It could be revoked before that. I think that's unlikely. It could be extended into 2021-22. Just a reminder here, the continuity direction, which places that legal duty on you to provide immediate remote learning for young people, only applies to reception children up to year 11s. It doesn't apply post 16, although of course most schools are offering remote learning to their sixth forms, but legally it doesn't apply to them. It also doesn't apply to absences that are not COVID related. So normal absences, normal illnesses, it doesn't apply there. But again, if you've got those plans in place, why wouldn't you offer it to them? And I think perhaps most importantly for the 8th of March, is it only applies to students who have been told, either by their school or by Public Health England, or because of national lockdown, that they cannot attend school because of COVID. So if a bubble bursts. If you have students or parents who in 2 weeks' time don't feel it's safe to return, they have no legal, you have no legal obligation to provide those students with remote learning. Now, of course, again, for the sake of community cohesion, you might well want to do that, but they are not covered legally by the direction. It's only if students cannot attend school, not if they choose not to. Just a reminder that from a week and a half ago, it's now a legal requirement to publish your remote learning expectations on your website. We rather felt it was before then anyway, so we're slightly confused about that, why that's been brought forward as a new piece of legislation, but there we are. But it is now an additional legal requirement to publish that on your website. You'll have seen the DfE guidance, obviously the big changes to that. At secondary, 5 hours per day of remote learning. It should include daily contact with teachers. That daily contact can be asynchronous rather than synchronous. So it could be students asking questions and a teacher comes back to them later in the day. And you must have a named member of SLT responsible for remote learning. The Ofsted guidance, if you've not seen the 2 pieces of research Ofsted have released on this, there's a short guide and a longer guide by Daniel Moy. They are brilliant, I have to say. I think they're really useful guidance documents. So if you've not had a look at that guidance, I really strongly urge you to. And I think moving forward, what we're hearing from ASCL members is there might be a bit of a blended approach in terms of what we want to keep. So any devices or dongles that have been given to you by the DfE through the allocation scheme remain your property, and you can deploy those as you wish. So either you can allow students to keep them while they're still at school with you. You can redistribute those. I did have a situation where a head teacher had an email from a student saying that their dongle wasn't working and could they help them. And I think they thought it was a safeguarding issue until I explained what a dongle actually is. So that was one of our Friday fundies that we quite enjoyed. You'll have seen that the Oak National Academy is now zero tariff, which means that regardless of your data plan, regardless if you've got the government data plan, if you access Oak National Academy, then it doesn't use any of your data up. I think this is a really, really exciting development and could be extended and continued to other educational websites. Certainly what I would like to see is that all school websites, including their learning platforms, are made zero rated in the future. So I think that's a really exciting development. And we've been asking people, what are your COVID keeps? What do you want to keep? And this idea of a blended approach to remote learning has come up time and time again. So people saying actually those high quality explanations about new concepts often are much better than I'm able to do as a teacher, particularly for the younger staff. So keeping that, where you have staff absence in terms of homework, in terms of assessing students, all of these new tools that we discovered will be utilised much more in the future. Obviously, that's a big implication on workload. And I think probably what we're hearing is the biggest COVID key is that remote parents' evenings that everyone seems to be in favour of. And it'd be interesting if you share that view. So again, just a few key questions to take back into school, which may or may not be useful. So I'll send all these slides to Alison. But have you factored the potential need for ongoing remote provision into your March the 8th action plans? There's a good chance you'll have a significant number of students that still have to stay home as the pandemic continues. Is your website compliant with those new legal duties? And just thinking through what aspects of that remote provision would you want to keep as a school? And have you asked your teachers that ahead of the return on the 8th of March? So very briefly on Ofsted, obviously they've been running their additional monitoring inspections since January. I think we were very disappointed because the operational note, which came out on the 6th of December, we felt was very positive. It was focused on support of the most vulnerable schools, particularly schools that are inadequate or have had to requires improvement judgments. And the note that came out just over a month ago, in the 20th of January, was significantly different. So the first thing to point out about these spring visits is, unlike the ones planned in December, these are additional. So they are outside the remit of the normal inspection routine. So they go nowhere to suggesting that a school may be on its journey to good or outstanding. They don't recommend a full Section 5 inspection if a school may be out of inadequate or RI. So they are additional. So if you are in the situation as an inadequate school, you probably will have received an autumn visit. You will have or will receive a spring visit, and then you'll be back into the normal inspection routine. So it's a lot of inspection activity at a time that's very challenging. Big change of focus. So the focus is on how you're delivering the curriculum in the current climate, particularly around remote education and education for vulnerable children and children of key workers on site, as opposed to the normal Section 8 focus on your improvement from the last inspection. Big changes to the inspection activity. At least until Easter, they will be done, inspections will be done remotely. And so again, you'll see the detail there, but it does include potentially HMI visiting online lessons, HMI talking to senior leaders, teachers and students over webcam. And then of course there's a change of outcome. So again, going back to that change of focus, in a usual Section 8 inspection, the outcome might be this school may no longer be inadequate, and I recommend a full Section 5 inspection. Now the outcome is binary. It is either that this school is providing effective education in the current context, or this school is not providing a quality of education in the current context. So again, I think quite unhelpful and quite deeply divisive. So, when will we return to EIF? I think after Easter, we're realistic. We can see there may be some gradual return to normal inspection. Of course, the EIF as published in 2019 will need to be reviewed and changed in light of the current situation, and will hopefully build on the work they've done around remote education. I think a key area that Ofsted may start to look at, which they've only tentatively done so far, is the extent to which catch-up funds are being used and how effectively schools are helping students catch up with education. I have to say, Jeff hates the term catch-up and finds it very insulting, but that's the term we need to use in the context of the grant. And of course, it's worth noting that Amanda Spillman's term of office ends at the end of this year, so we will likely have a new chief inspector this time next year, and it'll be interesting to see the direction of travel that she or he takes the inspectorate into. So again, just some questions on this section to take back into your school. To what extent is your curriculum being delivered remotely? Are there areas of the curriculum, both within subjects and perhaps whole subject areas, that you're just unable to deliver remotely? And are you planning to prioritise those when students do return? And how are you using catch-up funds? Of course, we had the new announcement around more money for catch-up yesterday. So again, just thinking through, where do you want to place that emphasis? I'm going to finish finally on performance data, and perhaps something that's not been mentioned particularly today in light of all the exam stuff. But what DfE have confirmed is that these are the headline measures for 2021. So for secondary and post-16, it will be subject entries at Key Stage 4 and Key Stage 5, including EBAC entry, and destination for Key Stage 4 and Key Stage 5, and that is it. So those are the performance measures for this summer. So no Key Stage 2 data whatsoever. There will be no Key Stage 4 or 5 performance data. And what I think is very, very helpful, and we've been pushing very hard at ASCL for, is not only will that performance data not be published, it won't even be calculated for use by the DfE or Ofsted. So DfE regional teams and Ofsted will not have access to your Key Stage 4 and 5 data from this summer, as it has been in 2020. There were plans to produce attendance data, but given the latest lockdown and the continued disruption, there will be no attendance data for any phase of schools. So on your school performance page that's publicly available, the latest data will remain 2019, but one thing we said is there are some schools that actually that data doesn't reflect where they're currently at. So that data will still be there in light of there being no new data, but with a big caveat saying this is historical data. So take that into account. So one of the things is implications of performance management. How do you do more holistic and nuanced performance management in light of the fact that we'll have 2 years without any headline data? And just to say, if you've not been part of the ASCL Open Data Project or the 6 into 7 project, this was led by my predecessor Duncan Baldwin, who said schools should take ownership of their data, and we should use this intelligently. And the 6 into 7 project grew out of that, and it's essentially a standardized way that your feeder primaries can give you information about students' achievement and performance in particularly in English and maths and a few other areas of development. I think there is a small cost to secondary schools, but it's entirely free for primaries to use. So if you haven't used or haven't heard of 6 into 7, I can certainly put you in touch with colleagues who can talk to you more about it. And so finally, from me on this point, kind of key questions from senior leaders. With the lack of data this summer, again, what's the narrative that you'll be telling when the local press ask you for your headline measures? We don't have those. What's the narrative you'll be telling? What narrative do your governors or trustees want you to say? What data can help you inform the impact of your curriculum? Again, if we're looking at curriculum intent, implementation, and impact, what evidence do you have your curriculum is working with the lack of national data? And then how can you set and review performance management targets, again, with that lack of data? I hope there's been a sort of very whirlwind tour through a lot of very, very big issues that have come out today. But I hope that's been useful. I'll be unpacking more of these throughout the term on our ASCL Leading On webinars, which if you've not signed up to, then please do consider. It's our online ASCL annual conference in 2 weeks' time, which is taking place across a fortnight with various different workshops, but also keynote speakers and plenaries. And just to say, always myself and other members of the ASCL team are always available for any tailor-made or bespoke sessions you want from us. Certainly I've done a number of these with governing bodies and with trustees or senior teams, if it's useful for someone to talk through, for example, this summer's grading with your governors, then please do be in touch. But as I said, I can be around for about another half an hour, Nigel, if there are any specific questions.
Perfect. Thank you very much indeed, Tom. That was really, really helpful to everyone, I'm sure.